So Verena, the floor is yours.
So we start now, yes?
Yes.
So I would very warmly to welcome you, the international audience of our already sixth workshop on child rehabilitation after the Holocaust, war and genocide. So before I introduce Dalia Ofer to you, I would like to say some sentences about our concept. So our project, Children After the Holocaust, War and Genocide, is part of the Western Galilee's Holocaust Studies program, and within that, part of its online program. And you should all register for the online program because it's quite interesting. And it's interesting because, I mean, Dalia, you mentioned it, that it's a pity that we cannot meet personally, but in the end, it's also very interesting that we have a much larger audience due to this online series. It's also something positive. Because last time we met in February 2020 in Berlin at Potsdam University, and naturally we had only 25 participants. So as you maybe all know, it is our concept or our approach to bring together practitioners from today's world, historians who work on the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II, caretakers and stakeholders. So this is the second time that we are on Zoom now. It's very nice to have you here. And I'm very happy that all of you are already here, because I almost forget that it's Israel time today. So thanks for joining us. So now we start with our first speaker with the opening remarks by Professor Dalia Ofer. And Dalia is Max and Rita Haber Professor. She's an Emerita of Holocaust and Eastern European Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I was very impressed because she received so many awards for her research and her work. I will mention only 2 or 3 of them. For example, Dalia received the Ben Tzvi Award for her book, Escaping the Holocaust, Illegal Immigration to the Land of Israel, and another award for the English version of this book. She received also the Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies from the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University in the United States, and this was in 2018. Professor Ofer directed the Avraham Haman Institute of Contemporary Jewry and the Vidal Sassoon International Research Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. She was visiting professor all over the world, for example, in Harvard, Yale, Brandeis, the University of Maryland, and the University of Sydney. And she was a Charles Revson Foundation Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And thanks, Dalia, to have you here today.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased and I'm very happy to know about the continuation of these workshops and the work that combines the contemporary and the past, which seems to me very, very important. And I remember when Boaz started to talk about it a number of years ago, and I was really very encouraged about it. I'm only saying a few opening remarks, so you shouldn't wait for a paper. And I want to mention that we are experiencing today a lot of children refugees in war zones, in countries, to places that they escaped, in temporary camps and more. And I know from my family's experience how young adults in Israel were going to assist children in camps in Greece a number of years ago, and in other places, and how the kibbutz movement in Israel tried to organize psychological and teaching assistance to such kids, mainly in Greece. These kids are girls and boys, young and teenagers, and each of them has a voice which may be similar, which may be different, which is hard to listen to, which is difficult to understand because of different languages. But these are voices that we have to hear. It's our obligation to hear. And today, I don't have to tell you that we are probably will experience from the events that we have in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, new voices of refugees, new voices of children of different ages. And this is certainly very, very sad to have again and again the situation of uprooted children. We can learn from history, can we? Can human societies, political leaders, and civilians, when they go to vote, think of the contemporary and of the past? War tragedies continue, and our particular goal as researchers, educators, and practitioners in other fields is to enlighten the knowledge about the past and tell stories, contemporary and past events, to enlighten the understanding, to express the importance of this knowledge, and to tell the narratives of the children. As educators, we wish, as practitioners who work on the field, all wish that it would resonate in the minds and ears of the policymakers and sound loud in the public discourse. I'm not sure that that's what is happening. Children expressed their narratives in different ways. To listen to these narratives is part of our responsibility. And I think this is what we are trying to do in these workshops. To explore diaries, compositions, those in archives and those again who are written now, to read letters that were wrote in the past and that are written in the present, to listen to their voices through oral testimony, that many of them are in front of our eyes and very easy to access today with all the technological development. While reading and listening to their narrative, we hear the feelings of anger, of joy, innocence, and hope. With great attentiveness, if we do it, we also listen to their hopeful search for justice and call to the adults to correct the wrongs, and how they strive, they, the children, the teenagers, to manipulate to survive or for survival. Manipulation for survival holds nice acts, but also not such nice acts. But all this should be looked in the context of the activities, the wishes, and the abilities of these young people to survive. Yes, survival is a major voice. It is dominant with all its qualification and with a quest for a better world, to a system that would secure safety and social order. When we listen carefully, a mixture of desperation, loneliness, and the search for love and hope govern many of the narratives. And these are all at the same time. And therefore, we have 2 ears, but we have to have many layers of the ability to listen to this narration and understand what is really expressed and how this is expressed in the voices of these children. Let us do our work with the hope and dedication that we want to contribute to the knowledge and to the better and more safer contemporary world. I was writing this, and I can't escape that in my mind and in front of my eyes while writing it came up a sad story of my country that happened just yesterday. A 14-year-old Palestinian boy was buried after being killed by an Israeli soldier. It is not a bad soldier and a good boy. It is not bad or good or wrong and right. It is a wrong reality that creates these tragedies. And if we will express as much as we are able, at least we can hope to bring the awareness and perhaps understanding and empathy, and if we are able, also sympathy to the stories that are narrated by these children. Thank you. I'm sure that this workshop, as I looked at the content and on the list of speakers, is important. My experience, contemporary and the past, is the Holocaust, but there are many more experiences that has to be taken in account when we are talking about these issues. So thank you for inviting me. If I am able in the future, I will contribute a paper in my special field of research. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Dalia, and thanks that you are joined us today. And now I give the word to Boaz.
Yes, we are starting the first session. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, and I will stop him after 20 minutes. Be aware. And the time that we for questions will be in the end. If anyone has a questions, please write it in the chat. Even if we will not have a chance to ask or to address all the questions, we can still move them to the speakers, and we can be in touch with them and stuff. So, as we said, we are bringing together practitioners and historians. However, we are and I have a very European panel, starting with two panels are European actually, but we have 3 countries in my panel. We are starting with Ms. Maria Kaldani of the Home Project in Greece, in Athens. She's a social worker working with refugees since 2004 in accommodation integration projects. She has been working in the social department of the Greek Council for Refugees and was project manager for European funded refugee projects at RCIS, Association for Social Support of Youth. She's been a member of the UNHCR working group since 2008. She's trained in design, implementation, evaluation of humanitarian programs, monitoring children's rights, sexual and gender-based violence prevention in the EU reception and asylum sector. And today she will speak with us about apart from family, becoming unaccompanied after entering a safe country. Please, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. Thank you very much. It's really not only a pleasure, but really an honor to be with you, with all of you. I hope that at the end I'm still a social worker working on the field, so that's my real identity at the end of the day. When we discussed about our participation as home project here in this conference, we were thinking that it might be interesting for all of you to see, beside the fact what we're doing as home project and what kind of aspects we need to work with the kids, that they are victims of this traveling around the countries in order to find a safe country in the meanwhile, and entering Greece. This is our experience. That it would be really interesting to see a second phase after entering EU regarding how many kids they are becoming unaccompanied while they are in Greece, and that we see as a result of belonging to a moving family or a refugee family. I apologize for my English. It's not my mother language. It's my second language. So please, if you don't understand something or if I speak too fast because I'm still a Mediterranean, please interrupt me and I will repeat. Thank you very much. I apologize from the beginning. I will try to share my so I need you to give me the right to share my screen.
You're a co-host. It should be, it doesn't work for you?
Yes, please try it now.
Yep. Okay, that's perfect. So it was a matter of timing. So I hope that you see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the confirmation. And I hope that you hear me very well. So I will try to give you a little bit of an idea what kind of work and what we do in our shelters. And in order for you to understand what are the aspects and what are the issues that we have to deal with unaccompanied minors in everyday life from the beginning. So the Home Project is a non-governmental organization starting in 2016 in Athens, Greece. I have to remind you that in 2015, we had a big refugee flow in Greece. More than 1 million people, they came in and they passed through Greece. It was not a new picture for Greece because many people, for many years, we've had refugees from many countries, but the numbers were really bigger. So in the Home Project, we started and we notified that we had more than 5,000 unaccompanied minors in the Greek territory registered. And for this, and at the moment, we had less than 1,000 places for them. So as you can imagine, 1 out of 5, they would be in a shelter, that means safety, and the rest would be in a really unsafe conditions. So what we are doing and what is our goal is to receive children that they are in many areas, from the streets, the camps, the police stations, detention centers, and we're trying to bring them in the safety of the services that we provide in our homes in order to provide them what we call a holistic network of child protection services. And by this, we mean that what every child deserves in its life. So this is just a little bit of understanding what an unaccompanied minor is. It's a child that enters from a third country, that enters the Greek territory without any guardian or responsible adult for its care. Regarding a refugee, I think it's more than we run 14 shelters at the moment. So far, more than 750 children have received our services. And by that, we mean, of course, covering the food, the housing, the accommodation, psychosocial support, psychological support, psychiatric support in cases, medical and legal support, as well as education. Our second pillar of working is that we need to create a job, to create jobs. We have more than 170 jobs that have been created both for the Greek and refugee community. I also need to remind you that on 2016 was a really hard period for Greece. We had austerity measures, and it was the national economy was not in the best position. So one of our goals was to create jobs for new professionals, but also for the community, for people that they belong to the migrant or refugee community. And the second pillar of our job is to provide added value to the local economy by renting and renovating vacant buildings and engaging the local communities. That means that we want to if we can imagine our work as in cycles, that we work in the home, in the close community, and then overall. So what is our child protection model? Again, I'm showing you that all in order to understand what kind of needs these kids they have. Where we have a first pillar is the mental health, psychiatric, psychological, and individual sessions, educational needs, school attendance, skill training, external activities. The third one is the pedagogical. This is the day-to-day functionality, forming relationship, adaptation to the concept, and pursue autonomy to many of the kids. The social adjustment, integration, family and peer relationships, the community around the houses, and the last but not the least, for sure, when you're a migrant or a refugee, the legal support. This means this talk is talking about family reunification and asylum procedures in Greece. Now, about the mental health, we have psychiatric supervision. I mean, we have the luck to have a child psychiatrist in our team. So that means that every house has one psychologist that follows up all the cases of the kids that they live in the house. We also have clinical meeting with all the psychologists and the coordinator for the mental health. So we also see that in an overall, and the child psychiatrist that also monitors the cases. Also, what is important and for us was really important to be done is to have a staff supervision. We have weekly staff supervision from an external specialist in mental health. And that was because the stories, as Professor Ofer referred, the stories of the children that we accommodate, they are really hard for anyone, even if you are prepared to listen to them by profession. I mean, being a social worker or being a psychologist, you are never prepared to hear that from small kids to tell you things that they should never happen to anybody. So in order to monitor the way that we work with the kids, we have an individual development plan. This is a planning of what we have to do in short and long-term intervention and according to the child needs and according to their cases, legal cases or other issues. Regarding the social, we are trying to create a community around the kids that we accommodate. That means that we're trying to promote integration through the local community, and by local community, we mean really the community around the house, because it is really hard to understand the people that who is the child that we accommodate. That there is no fear, that there are children that they need protection. So the first step is the local shops, the local pharmacy, this local bread shop to know us and to understand that we are not, they're not hostile to us, and then this to be duplicated to the rest of the community. The education is a very important issue for us because that's in many of the kids that we accommodate. They didn't have the chance ever to be in school because of moving in order to be safe. They lost at least 4 to 5 years of schooling, and as I said, in many cases, because of their nationality, because of their sex, they didn't have ever the chance to participate in school. For us, it's also important to create a routine in that. I mean, what we're trying to do in our homes is to recreate, to refine what is a normal way of living for a child. And that means that the school isn't there, the leisure activities, the fact that they need to have new skills, to know new things about them. So pedagogically, which is the everyday life in the house, that means that we need to recreate relationships, to reestablish the trust, and also to welcome these kids to a new reality. Not a different, not change, not something bad or worse, but another reality that they have to live in. And that's really something that we need to work every day. Regarding the legal support, we have the asylum procedure. That means that we need to inform the minors about their rights and the obligation during the asylum procedure, to represent the minors throughout the asylum process, and to prepare them for the asylum interview, which is one of the hardest things to do at the end. We also have kids for family reunification. In this case, means that members of their close family, they are another EU member. So the family reunification, according to the asylum law in the Dublin case, is going to happen legally. We need to make all the paperwork for that. This means that we need to identify the case who are eligible for cases for family reunification, to contact with families in other EU countries, and to apply via the Dublin regulation. One thing that we're really happy about is that the kids that we have with us, they grow up with us. So not only creating new jobs for staff that they are refugees and Greek youth professionals, but also for the kids that they are growing up with us and they can be part of our model. And by that, it is really important for us, members of the community or new adults, that they work into the shelter so they can be like role models for them, for the rest of the kids, that things can be done, a new reality can be here, and there is a hope in that. So going back to what I said at the beginning, what it means becoming an unaccompanied minor after entering the safe country. Almost 30% of the children that we accommodate have become unaccompanied after entering Greece. That means that they were coming into Greece, usually from Turkey or from the land borders of Greece with, again, with Turkey in many of the cases, that they come into with some relatives or their parents or one of the parents, and at one point they don't have anyone to take care of them. So that's the moment that they come into our homes. The reasons of these children becoming alone at the end is because their takers or their parents, they're seeking for a better living condition and a faster asylum procedures. Right now, it could take up to 2 years just to apply for asylum, and the pandemic also was one of the reasons of everything being very late. Separation of the family due to miscommunication or domestic abuse. That means that maybe the parents of the kids, they're having a divorce or they're separated because now they feel free enough to make this kind of choices. In many cases, we have usually lone women that they decide to leave an abusive marriage. Domestic violence, abuse or sexual abuse towards children within the family. This is something that in many of the cases, it is a result of the fact that the parents, they have been through so many traumatic experiences that this has an effect to their kids. Connection with the communities or the relatives. The adults, they decide to go to another European country because this will be easier for them to belong to a community. They have relatives, close relatives to other countries, and not to be able to be responsible for the new situation. This is something that we see that a lot. There are people that they are losing everything at the end of the day. They don't have a common language with Greece. They don't have a common, even the fact that they don't know how everything is working. This means that they feel desperate and they cannot take the responsibility of their kids, sometimes not even for themselves. And
Maria, 4 minutes.
Yeah,
4 minutes.
yeah. I'm going very fast. So. And another thing is that many of the kids that we accommodate, they are suffering from mental health disorders because of being refugee and being they have traumatizing experiences, and their parents, they cannot really deal with that. What the children are feeling is they're feeling alone for the second time again. They're feeling abandoned, which is a new feeling for them. They're feeling that they're not important. For someone to keep with them, and the feeling that they cannot trust anybody, not their family, so who am I going to trust? And they're feeling that they're undertaking adults' responsibilities in cases that we have siblings. What is our goal in that is that we're trying to re-establish the trust to the adult figures, the members of the staff, the external specials, to re-establish the feeling of belonging that a community wants me, the community of the house, the overall community. A provision of information and support in this new reality, because it's changing. So at one point, they are not members of the family anymore. To re-establish the relationship with the relatives that they left them behind, because maybe we need to make a family reunification procedure, and to create an everyday normality in accordance to their age, schooling, leisure, and educational activities. And due to the individual development plan that I referred to before, to refer them to a foster family, to a foster system or the adoption national system. I had a case, but I think that I just wanted to say about that, but I think we can discuss that if we have any questions. I think I am on time.
You did it on time.
Yeah.
And this was very, very interesting. I must tell you that as people who are researching post-World War II children, there are so many issues here that meet. And this is one of the things that has been pushing Verena and myself to do this work, is to let us listen to the people working with children today and to bring our knowledge to help people working with children today. And I must say that what we were looking at is we are not going to change the political reality. We have to look at the children. War affected children are here. And now in the Ukraine, we'll have more, unfortunately. And it is we have to look at the children. And politically, everyone will do what he wants, but we are looking at the children. And this is why we bring together people like you, Maria, and someone like the next speaker, our very own Verena Buzer, my colleague, Dr. Verena Buzer, of Potsdam University of Applied Sciences, and also an affiliated researcher with in the Holocaust Studies program in Western Galilee College. Her research focuses on the areas of Achshara and non-Zionist immigration preparations for youth, young adults, childhood and youth during and after the Shoah, with a focus on minors in concentration camps, and child search and child rehabilitation after World War II. Her work was supported by the Memorial Foundation of the Jewish Culture and the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, the Hadassah Brandeis Institute in Waltham, and the Edith Sauer Funds in Vienna. I must say that Verena is the colleague with whom we dreamt about doing this and also made it happen. So it's really a good chance to say thank you, Verena. Before you speak, I'll say after you speak as well. And now the floor is yours.
Yes, Boaz, thank you for the introduction. I will try to share now my screen with all of you. You can see it, I hope. Yes?
Yes.
But now I don't see it.
You have to enlarge the PowerPoint. Yes. Okay.
So I put my clock on, yes. So just this morning, as many of you, I assume, I was listening to a radio broadcast of the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, in which a woman described how her city had been departed due to the military actions. What she mentioned, it was only a side note. My daughter. She mentioned in a side note that her children and her family. Immediately, I thought about the impact of the war and our today's event, of course. Again, here in the Ukraine, as in other parts of the world, the most vulnerable group is again the children, of whom many will now, I think, will lose their home, and probably many of them will enter the European Union as refugees, probably many of them unaccompanied. So, in a brochure as of 1951, which you cannot see it, published by the UNESCO, it is stated, and I quote here, "It is not the actual events of war which have affected children emotionally. They can get used to the greatest dangers and do not even realize the risk, provided that they can keep with them the protector who in their childish hearts represents security, and that at the same time they can clutch some familiar object in their arms," end quote. So when I first read this quote, I was a little bit confused, but when thinking and reflecting more on it, I understood that there lies at least a small true core within it. Children indeed become used to the events of wars, genocide and murder, and other traumatic events. And then I remembered back, and I learned already during my PhD about children in concentration camps, while I analyzed testimonies of Jewish child survivors. Becoming used to does not mean that there is no psychological damage. But exactly from the same survivor testimonies, I additionally learned that as long as families had been together, and even in the case where the parents died and small surrogate families were established, these small entities provided security and protection and helped that the children from then had a sense of stability. In many cases, they had the ability to live a satisfying life in their later years. And sometimes, which I learned from children of survivors, these surrogate families from them, I don't know why, as there's not yet any research about it, are connected, also these surrogate families are connected strongly with each other until today and exist besides the biological family. So in the same brochure, I found another insight, which is the following. And I quote again, what does affect a child is the influence of events on the emotional ties of the family, the rupture of the habitual living environment, and above all, the sudden loss of the mother, end quote. Now in the following, I will focus a little bit more on the questions with a focus on the aftermath of the Holocaust, on the questions of home and belonging, which are then as well as today, two intertwined important issues for children and teens after the Holocaust, war and genocide. So deprivation of home has different colors and can appear in different forms. So the loss of the mother is only one form. Means on the personal, social, societal, and educational level, excuse me, I have to tell her that she's, one thing, Alma, mach mal leiser. Sorry, because I hear her very loud. So you still see my screen, I hope. Okay. So deprivation of home has different colors and can appear in different forms. For example, the sudden loss of a mother. Means on, for example, and on the personal, social, societal, and educational level, only to mention some aspects now. The stakeholders from then, among which was the most prominent the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and its successor, the International Refugee Organization, elaborated in one of its earliest reports, which I will introduce today, the psychological state of mind of the DP population, a heterogeneous refugee population in many countries, especially in the Western occupation zones, on which I will focus today, of liberated Germany. Jewish child survivors, minor, Middle and Eastern European forced laborers, for example, from Poland, the Ukraine, the Soviet Union, as well as those from Western Europe, like the Netherlands or France, had to live side by side with German refugees, which were expelled through the Allied forces in the wake of the liberation of Nazi Europe. And of course, for the displaced persons, which was a legal term by the UNRWA, by the United Nations, were housed separate from this population. Especially the persecuted and surviving children were in the beginning housed together until DP centers for Jewish children only were established. This report, and I show it to you here, only the intro, the first page and a quote from it.
Enlarge the screen.
Really? Okay. Now?
Yes.
This report was vivid, but not what I found interesting, merely positive picture of the DPs. Of course, I understand that there are problematic issues in it. For example, putting all DPs together. Then it's a quite Western cultural understanding of flight and trauma, and or, for example, a quite culturally shaped concept of trauma and recovery. Only to mention some examples. And what I also find out, most probably the report is not based on an examination of DPs in liberated Germany of Europe, but more likely on the expertise of UNRWA workers and caretakers based in the Middle East since May 44, or in Southeastern Europe, like for example in Yugoslavia since January 45. What is fascinating about this portrait of about the psychological problems is that it reports the whole picture internally and externally. Parallel to this, it tries to raise empathy also for the negative sides of DP life. In the beginning, they focus merely on adults, and but to understand the whole picture where these children lived then, we understand more the scenery where they had to live in. All of these children crossed borders due to deportation, flight, or forced migration, belonged to neither place, lost their homes, especially Jewish children, forever, as they could not return to their departure countries. Loss of home, which was the reality to all of these children, implies naturally also the search for a new life. And Maria, she gave us some very nice examples how they can obtain at least the first steps into a new life. So a general comment to this report: we are all aware of the fact then as today that reports need a certain language. A language, of course, which underlines the successful implementations of relief and recovery techniques, the successful rehabilitation of the refugee children in question, and most often evaluations have to prove that good practice projects concerning the children are working. Against this background, the general atmosphere described here is unflattering and shows us the reality of refugee life from then. The so-called characteristics, you see a small part of the table of contents about the adult population. Within that is the place where the children lived, were found in a state of deprivation of affectionate ties with others. And this was, according to the caretakers, perhaps the most damaging emotional hurt which a human being can receive. And then it is said that such people in their relationship to authority tend to return, and I know that this is a critical, very critical assumption, at least in part, return to dependent attitudes of children. I know that it's problematic. But they said also that food, warmth, and security from physical danger are not or were not merely essential to satisfy bodily needs. So, and I quote now, "It is important to discuss in more detail the way in which painful emotional conflicts are banished from the mind. The process is known as repression and works automatically, that is, without knowledge or will of the individual." And I found it quite interesting that they found, for example, they spoke a lot of delinquency of the adults, stealing, promiscuity, prostitution, and the more general demoralization state of mind. So, and then there was a quite critical, but nevertheless quite interesting analysis of the behavior disorders of children, because the caretakers from then and the UNRWA workers, welfare workers, found a lot of anxiety due to the loss of home and the loss of emotional and societal and individual ties, outbursts of rage, violent behavior, and they interpreted it as a means of protecting the children, protecting themselves from their anxiety. Many were found to be sad, at least, to find satisfaction in being in violent scene. They regarded adults as enemies, were depressed, or dreamy, which meant oblivious of what is going around them. And they interpreted it as a form of adaptation to a shattered world, because they had to survive by stealing, were victims of violence. They, in a weird sense, psychological sense, felt responsible for the dreadful events, which is very tragic, of course. They had feelings of retribution. They were victims of rape, both boys and girls, and suffered from feelings of guilt, feelings of feeling defenseless. And as a result, it was said, I quote, "They will, however, tend to cling anxiously to the little that is familiar in their new surroundings. Children accompanied by anxious, shattered grown-ups will be feeling that there is nothing trustworthy about life. They will have suffered the bewilderment and fear of finding themselves suddenly without support." And what could be done then for the children? One means, for example, in cases where the children could not stay with mother or father or relatives, it was taken into account that they could be put into family-like groups, also among peers. Also, Maria just spoke about that. And then it was stressed that once they were settled, it was regarded as mandatory that few changes should be made, and they should be housed in a stable background. I quote, "They should be able to regard a definite place as home, and they should remain in the care of the same grown-ups," end quote. And the greatest source for help was seen in the ability of children to recover, and they implemented measures for their self-help. For example, there are many very nice examples of how they should play, what the children should be given. They should play with mud and earth because this relieves stress and tension. Then it said muscular play and sport, constructive work, giving them tasks in daily life where they can take over responsibility. And I stress this so because when in 2015, there was I only speak from the German perspective, they were so busy in establishing shelters and so on, but there was no concept how to erect a shelter. And there were so many failures. I know it from 3 or 4 caretakers who worked in these shelters, a lot of money, but no concept to work with the children. And I know a far colleague, she wrote a concept funded by I don't know which organization, but that there is a big deficit in the shelters and the housing of children in these shelters. So now I come to the conclusion. When I read the whole report, I thought, okay, I give it to the German government. They can learn from it a lot. No, but when I read the whole the whole report, I forgot something. These are pictures from the UNRWA missions all over Europe from then, with examples from Greece, Italy, Poland, here on the right, down from Germany. So when I read this report, this is one children's center in Germany, I came to the following thoughts. The described UNRWA guidelines for relief workers were less guidelines, but more a call for empathy, understanding, and can be conceptualized as a warning message to misinterpret behavior of the DP children. The demands, of which I mentioned a few, have come from an explicit Western perspective and may have been interpreted in other parts of the world different, but nevertheless discuss the many problems and challenges and hardships of a refugee population, and may the approach of refugees being defined as hurt children, the adults, be highly problematic. It raises questions which are also an issue today in Germany, especially after the refugee crisis in Europe in the wake of the years 2014 and 15. So to come to full circle, the caretakers from then made exact examinations, worked closely with the children and were well aware of the challenges that came with this refugee crisis from then. They developed instruments on a day-by-day stand, on the spot, in the United Children Centers, and thus piled up practical knowledge and established best practice models, which are of immense worth also for today's world. Thank you.
Thank you, Verena. It's amazing to see how your presentation on material from the 50s and children in the 50s and 40s and Maria's presentation about today is, I think, just proving how much what we are doing is important. Our third speaker is Dr. Amy Williams. We congratulate her on her recent PhD. She's currently working with the Mitteldeutsche Verlag and the Yale University Press and Camden House to produce new books in the plural on the history and memory of the Kindertransport. She is a part-time lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, recently appeared on the BBC series Great British Railway Journeys. I will also say that what she didn't write is that she's really active in commemorating Kindertransport and doing a lot of projects, establishing a lot of rapport with the Kindertransport families. I think she's doing very valuable work for this story, and thank you for the work you are doing, Amy. Now you can start your presentation.
Gosh, thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you can see, oh, wrong slide. Here we go. So I'm just going to have to wait till this bar moves out of the way, and then I'll make it. It doesn't want to play. Okay, I'll leave it like that for a moment. Then I'll move it back to full screen in a second when the bar moves. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Yeah, as Boaz said, most of you know, that reconciliation isn't a topic that I particularly look at, but it's a topic that I've become much more interested in because of my work in the field of the transnational history and memory of the Kindertransport. And this is also because of a recent event that I have been doing with Dr. Chad MacDonald and Professor Bill Niven, Caroline Slifkin, Hannah Zach Miley, and Smaya Besso. So it's quite strange, talking about reconciliation today, considering or in light of what's happening in Europe as we speak. So yeah, the topic of reconciliation, why am I talking about this? Why am I connecting the Kindertransport to Bosnia? Well, over the last, as Boaz was saying, over the last 2 years, I've been interviewing Kinder all around the world. I think I've done around 100 interviews. And I was really quite surprised when we got into the post-war period, how many survivors actually spoke about Bosnia. So there were so many Kindertransport connections with Bosnia. And it really started to capture my attention. And one thing that in particular that started to inspire me to look at reconciliation is that before we think about conciliation in terms of Bosnia, is it possible for Hannah, for example, to connect with reconciliation because the events are further back? Whereas in Smaya's case, he's a child survivor of the Bosnian genocide, the perpetrators are still a lot closer in time. now I know I am aware of obviously growing anti-Semitism around Europe today, but in Bosnia there is still shifting borders and a sense of injustice still. And second and third generation are a lot younger compared to second and third generations with regards to the Kindertransport. So my first sort of question was, do you need a social dealing with the past before personal reconciliation can take place? And this is really interesting when it comes to the Kindertransport, because we saw these connections as we were doing these sorts of talks, as I've just mentioned, but also the interviews that I was doing separately. And I could see these connections. So the connections in terms of educational, cultural, charitable, and personal connections. So Hannah herself was in Bosnia at the time in the 90s. She met with survivors. They actually exchanged stories. They exchanged objects. If you live in the UK, there's been a recent BBC series called Saved by a Stranger. And this directly connected the experiences of refugee children, mostly on the Kindertransport, to those who were fleeing Bosnia. I also learned about Hans Lichtenstein's story. He was awarded an MBE for his work in Bosnia. He sent medical supplies there. And Jonathan Lichtenstein, his son, has recently written a book about that journey. Tamara and Aaron Barshak's parents, Fred and Miriam. Fred was on the Kindertransport. Miriam was a refugee that came over in the 50s, also took in refugees during this period. And then in terms of charitable connections, the Red Cross obviously took part in both of these atrocities. And literally just this morning, I was talking to Melissa Hacker, who is the president of the Kindertransport Association. I was telling her about this talk. And her as a second generation, she was very much aware of seeing the buses of children from Bosnia as she was making her documentary, My Knees Were Jumping. So, yeah, to sort of give you an idea about the two survivors that I'm going to be speaking to you about today, this is Hannah's story. And as I said, Hannah is much further on in this process of reconciliation, just because of her age and the timing of various events. She writes particularly about reconciliation in her book, A Garland for Ashes, which you can see a photo of. And Smayo is sort of more at the beginning of his journey towards reconciliation. And I think this is really interesting. We interviewed Hannah and Smayo together, and I'll shortly talk about what they both learned from one another. Now, last week, I talked about personal transactional memory at another conference. I'm not going to have a chance to go into it in any great detail here. And I spoke about this with Professor Bill Niven. But I do sort of want to pick up on a few of the ideas because I think they do connect with reconciliation. So personal transactional memory, as I've defined it, has its own development patterns outside of collective memory, for example, because of personal experiences, the ongoing age process. It's not necessarily affected in the same way as collective memory is. And I'm very much aware that personal transactional memory can be quite strongly contrasted. You know, one kinder might want and seek out forgiveness, whereas other kinder, some kinder might actively seek reconciliation, others may not want to seek or able to forgive. So, but they coexist. There isn't necessarily a negotiation between them. But what I've argued in the second or third paragraph in this particular slide is that personal transactional memory really does revolve around memories of loss, of relocation, of parting. And I think this is really interesting with regards to the work of reconciliation, because it is a two-way process, but it is also a personal process as well. Can reconciliation restore a part of somebody's identity, or reconnect them with a home and community? We've talked about reconciliation. I'll talk about reconciliation in more detail in a moment, but obviously personal transactional memory takes in those personal journeys. You know, the kinder hold arrival, transfer and departure in their heads constantly. And they're very much aware of this in terms of their mental movements, but when they're physically on the ground as well. And I think that's really an important process for reconciliation, which I'll come back to in a moment. Also, kinder are drawing wider ethical conclusions, from their transactional experiences. And I think, again, this is really important for reconciliation because they're aware of present crises that may arise, and this may sort of take them on a different journey towards reconciliation. So the meaning of reconciliation, well, it's the returning of the status quo ante. As I said, this isn't necessarily my topic of study, but it's something that I'm thinking about more in terms of Kindertransport studies. It's obviously the restoring of friendly relations. I would use reconciliation rather than conciliation, which sort of means the end of a dispute and that the two parties weren't necessarily on good terms beforehand. And some people did feel obviously part of the communities in which they were expelled from, obviously before they were expelled. When I interviewed the survivors, they made a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation, which I thought was interesting. Hannah and Smayo talked about they can't release this fear, that often forgiveness means, in Smayo's case, a sort of oblivion or letting people off the hook, whereas reconciliation was two sides coming together. And towards the end of the talk, I'll talk about performative and transformative reconciliation. But this just gives you an idea. Hannah and Smayo actually talked about their faith and how their faith has enabled them to take part in acts of conciliation. That Hannah said it's not just enough to personally forgive and, you know, let that release and that judgment to God. It was also about joining with other people. It wasn't just a one-way street. It wasn't just you can forgive and have that relationship with God. It needed somebody else from the other side, from the perpetrator perspective, to willingly face that uncomfortable history. So again, reconciliation means that both survivor and perpetrator are coming together on a personal level, for them anyway. And it's really interesting to hear them speak together, to sort of, Hannah was very much helping Smile on this sort of journey towards reconciliation. And again, he's only, you know, on the early stages of this process, but he was very much taking on what Hannah had said. And what I found really interesting is that neither of them live in the country they were expelled from. So this reconciliation process takes place in their minds, but also when they go back to either Germany or Bosnia. And Smayo talked about how reconciliation is costly. You know, you are essentially re-traumatizing or reliving that process every time you go back. So the reconciliation process is not just, it doesn't happen once, it happens over and over again, not every time that you return, but also when you're back in your, you know, your country that that you're living in. Both survivors talked about seeking truth and compassion. I thought what it was interesting to hear from both of them, that they said, you know, you need to face all the complexities of these histories that we don't always face in terms of the Kindertransport. We sort of tend to think the Kindertransport is a movement from rescue, threat to safety. But as we know, new hurdles and new threats came in the host nations as well. And it's interesting to sort of think about the differences between journeys of return. As I was saying, does reconciliation look very different to survivors that live in Bosnia and Germany? Both, as I was saying, made this distinction between reconciliation and forgiveness. And as I was saying, as new crises arise, for example, what's going on in Bosnia at the moment with these sort of shifting borders, your relationship to reconciliation is constantly evolving and changing. How am I doing for time? So where does reconciliation take place? Well, in the heart and the mind, the survivors talked about. It's really interesting. Hannah spoke about how important place was for reconciliation. So not so long ago, she laid a memorial in a form of, in the Jewish cemetery where her family once lived, and she talked about how there was a group of them. There were Spaniards, there were Germans, there were Italians, and there was people from the US. So like a real international group. And she talked about how the Spaniard came over to her and talked about he came from the country of the Inquisition. The German talked about the more recent history around the Holocaust. The Italian also did as well. And the US person talked about slavery. So there was these sort of transnational acts of conciliation in a Jewish cemetery, which was really interesting. And I have a clip that Hannah talks about this, but I don't think we've got time to share it. So also,
you've got 7 minutes. It's a lot of time.
Oh, I have. Okay, I'll see it at the end if we've got time, because it's really amazing what she says. But conciliation can also take place, and for me, which is most interesting writing the books at the moment, is during anniversary events and around memorials. So my work looks at mainly memorialization and exhibitions and testimony, and reconciliation also takes place in the pages of people's autobiographies or through testimonies and podcasts. And this is what I've been learning more recently. And I'll just move on. So what does reconciliation look like then? So this is really interesting because it could be a counter memorial. As I was saying, these sort of acts of commemoration or can also be acts of reconciliation. So I'm going to give an example in a moment about a recent trip to Görlitz, but Hannah laying memorials is really interesting because it's not just remembering her family or re-establishing her identity within this community that expelled her. It's also about connecting with the next generations as well. And reconciliation can also be street names, the changing of names. We know that this is happening in Spain, for example. It's happened in Germany as well. However, it's not happened in Bosnia. So, it's very different for Smile, for example. Hannah goes back and is sort of embraced by her community. Very recently, the local committees got together to restore the synagogue. This isn't the case if we look at Smile's story. His hometown is actually still having marches, still playing particular music that is fascist. It's quite interesting. We've talked about the synagogue and that sort of the restoration project, and also in the Jewish cemetery. But in Smile's case, there are these sort of fascist marches that take place through the town and end up at the Catholic Church. So it's a very different relationship that the two survivors have with their former homelands. Again, what can conciliation look like? It can also take the form of truth commissions, trials. Both Hannah, for example, again, if we've got time to hear the clip, I'll talk about it. Physical embraces. Hannah.
We have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, no then. So Hannah spoke recently about another trip to Germany where she'd given a speech on the anniversary of her parents being gassed in Chelmsford, and one of the descendants of the guards there came over and embraced her and asked for forgiveness. So that there was a physical embrace, verbally asking for forgiveness. Acts of reconciliation can also be inviting survivors back to former cities and towns and reconnecting with them in that sense. And again, it's not just about inviting them back, it's actually re-establishing a presence in a community. So what are the conditions then for reconciliation to take place? Well, acknowledgement of the past, a willingness to face this past, a dialogue, invitations, as I was talking about. But there are these more complicated questions. Is it in the case of Smio, what happens if the perpetrator doesn't want forgiveness? What happens when reconciliation is forced upon you? And what happens when these sort of parties are still in power? Again, thinking about who reconciliation is with. Is it with descendants? Is it with nations? A question that I thought of today, do Kinder seek reconciliation with Britain, for example? Britain, yes, is the country that took them in, but it's also the country that interned them. It's also the country that sent them to other internment camps in Australia and Canada, for example. personal reconciliation is really interesting. I am nearly done. These family values and faith can play a big role with regards to this. Hannah spoke about togetherness and closeness, and I don't think I've got the time to go into that in any great detail, but again, sort of thinking about who you're doing the reconciliation with. It's not just with former perpetrators or their descendants. It's also Smayo's mother talked to him about what it means. Hannah talks at great lengths with her husband, for example. And just to end with then, very recently, I was invited to sort of be a fly on the wall to go back to Görlitz with descendants to Lei Stolperstein. It was organised by Lauren and Daniel. Lauren is from America and Daniel is from Germany. So again, you can see the two sides coming together, and it's quite interesting to think about how these conditions around reconciliation, there is a security, an internal security and an external security. It happens in the private and public spaces, but then also if we think about that's an example of survivors and their relationship with reconciliation. Here is an example with second generation, and as you can see, Judy's words, Renee's words as well. This is how second generation, they're not always looking for acts of reconciliation. Reconciliation can sort of be organized in a way sometimes, being invited back, but it can also be quite spontaneous. As Daniel says, he wasn't necessarily expecting to form new relationships. And then just to end with, very recently, a couple of, I think last week, Tamara, Amanda and Simon talked about the differences between transformative and performative memory. And I think this is really interesting, that acts of reconciliation was really interesting with regards to the Kindertransport, because we walked from the synagogue to the church, from the church to the synagogue. People actually lit extra candles when we walked around. Is it easy to pay homage when the community isn't there? Is reconciliation easy when people have a physical presence or when they just come back every so often? But I will say that, second generation are part of these one-by-one groups, that they are connecting with other descendants as well. And I can see Annette Jonas is on the call. And what I haven't talked about is reconciliation at the time. So her father, Peter Jonas, was in the army and went back to Germany in 1944 and really helped reunite the particular part of the country that he was working in with the British Army. And this is something also to think about the developments with reconciliation at the time, but also many, many years later. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Amy. We have time for questions, but hardly any. So I would like to take the prerogative of the chair, and I'm asking Maria, will you, we stopped you before you showed us a case study. Is it okay with you to show us this?
Yeah, actually, it was something that I'm going to say, so it's not like to show. I wanted to discuss about the case of one girl that she's from Syria. She came like 3 years before in one of our shelters. I will call her Nana for some reason. Nana came to us at the age of 15. She is from Syria. She came with her family. I mean, she entered the Greece with her whole family. I mean, like 2 parents, mother and father, and 3 siblings, brothers and sisters. While they were living in a camp, and in a period of which the camps were not really friendly to people. I mean, they had almost 50%, 500% over their capacity, accommodating people. So at one point, Nana had the chance to I mean, she had an experience that was really traumatizing, being in a war, living from a war. So she has all the images of what's happening when you have to leave, like in an emergency and not something that you can prepare it. On the same time, her brothers, they were soldiers for some years, and then they came back to the family in order to be able to leave. One of her brothers, they were really facing mental health issues after his experience as a soldier. And he was sexually abusing her while they were in Greece and on the road. When they came to Greece, for Nana was a chance that everything will go back. Everything will be the same way that it was when we were back in the home country. Unfortunately, the whole family was being so much deeply traumatized that even the father could not accept anymore that his daughter was not a virgin anymore. He could not accept that this was happening within the family, and the blame was on her. Her mother was not able to support her because she had no contact with the community around. She could not speak anything but Arabic, and she could not be outside the camp by her own in fear, because the conditions in the camps were really, really, how to say, sorry, you could not really walk around the camp if you were a woman. So she could not find anyone. At one point, the family gets out of the camp, and at this point, Nana decides that she's going to be against her brother. And for this reason, she's being taken out of her family. I'm saying this story, Nana now is 18. She lives in the shelter. She had to deal with so many fears, so many issues around her, so many ghosts around that. With the home country, what has happened back was she has seen while the trip was taking place, and also what has happened as a result of all this. At the same time, the family decides she also has some serious mental health issues. She's being self-harming to herself. She tried to commit suicide more than 5 times while she's living in the shelter. And at one point, her family left her back and leaving for another European country, saying that you cannot be with us. If you come with us, you will still, this will be an issue for our community. So I'm just saying that I wanted to use this story because it really shows how changing all the connections with everything around you, nothing is stable anymore, how this can influence a whole family, and at the end creates a child that really being traumatizing, as Professor Ofer says, layers of traumas. I used to say all the time that many people that they came at the beginning of this so-called refugee crisis, that do your kids have PTSD? And they said, our kids, they don't have the time to have PTSD. They're still suffering. So no, our kids, they don't suffer from PTSD because they're still having so many layers of trauma in that. And this, we can see that happening in the young people. I mean, like Nana, that she still has to deal with all these things that are happening around her, the domestic abuse, the family abuse, the being abandoned, and all of this was a result of a family that had to leave their house because of a war. I mean, that was not before, because many times the discussion was like, nothing was like that before for all of them. This changed everybody in this family. So I was just trying to with this example to show you that there are steps that they can be done. It makes huge efforts. I mean, for us, it's still a work on progress, I'm saying. She's still facing mental health issues. She has to deal also with the fact that she's becoming young adult right now. So being a teenager at the same time, it is an issue. But they have to struggle with so many things, so many changes around them, and the multiply effects of all these issues. I don't know if it was a good or bad example, but for us, it is really an example that shows that even if you have the status, because she gained asylum in Greece, finally, the fact that she still has to deal with all this. I mean, she needs to be in contact with her family. She cannot be in contact with that. she has the right to be out of her family, but at the same time, she needs to be connected with them. So I don't know. I hope this is helpful in order to show you that it takes long, really long, very long to deal with the things that you have been facing.
Okay, let's give a chance to the speakers. If you want to still a few words to say a few words, this is your chance if you want to. Verena, if you want to.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that my microphone's out. Yes, what I found always interesting is that these approaches and these stories from then and now, they are intertwined or they overlap and so on, and there are so many parallels. Yes, and sometimes if you read something from today, you think about your own research, or if you read something from then, you always think about what you read in the newspapers, what you experienced in refugee shelters, and so on. So I'm very grateful, Boaz, about this project.
Yes, certainly. We are happy with this. Amy?
Yeah, I think exactly. I think that we often talk about multidirectional memory or associative memory, but one memory can influence another. And I think I see that especially with Kindertransport testimony, how aware they are of other conflicts that are going on, past and present, and how they connect that to their own stories, whether that be the Kindertransport in Bosnia, and we see the similarities and differences with regards to how survivors reconnect with their former homelands, but also how survivors, especially in terms of the Kindertransport, just with what I'm more aware of, that they actually are inspired to write their testimonies because of more recent developments. So a lot of Kinder, when what was happening in Iraq, they actually say in their autobiographies, I'm writing this because of this. And I think also that, just to touch on both of your talks, how survivors are coming to these ethical conclusions, and that we really do need to learn from them. Boaz, you talked about how we might not be able to change things at a political level, and it doesn't look like we are. Even Lord Dubs, how many times has he put this refugee bill forward that it hasn't passed yet? But I think on a grassroots level, survivors are really having an impact.
Do you see any difference, Amy, between you showed a very reconciliating survivor of the Kindertransport, but do you hear other voices on reconciliation, not on involvement in present issues?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I said, I've only interviewed 100 survivors and their families. There were 10,000 that just came to Britain, let alone anywhere else. And the ones that I've spoken to are very for reconciliation, in terms of wanting to actively connect with the former homeland in some particular way, or restore a particular identity. A lot, I didn't talk about, passports in terms of Brexit and like restoring that as well. And I do see that as a two-way process. But there are some people that are very cautious and guarded about reconciliation, especially second generation as well, feeling, in these hostile environments that are building, sadly, that they do feel cautious to connect with people. I've not encountered anybody that is totally against it, but I would say people are cautious. But there's spontaneity in that. The people who went to Görlitz weren't necessarily thinking, oh, this is a reconciliation trip. This was a cousin's trip, and essentially to actually connect with the families that were broken up. It just so happened to connect on that wider level with the community. Not that there were not problems, but overall it was a positive experience.
Okay, anyone wants a question? You have a chance. If not, we'll start our break now. So okay, so we are meeting again. Thank you to the three amazing presentations and speakers and presentations we had now. For those of you, Verena and me are already in touch with Amy, but Maria, we have to be more in touch for the past. And I see that Myra is commenting that you can see parallels between your refugees and refugees in the US borderlands regarding trauma and migration. Of course, unfortunately, war is still here, and our focus is indeed in trying to learn lessons from what every one of us is doing to make the world a better place. I will say that also in my concluding words. But we are now going on break, and we are starting our next panel at 6:45. So with the indeed.
Yeah, so we're having our second and of course our last panel for today. I think the first one was already very fascinating. And now we come to our fourth speaker, Mr. Jan Graf. I hope I see him somewhere here. There he is. Hello. Okay. Yes. Yeah, and Jan Graf, as a social worker and intercultural specialist, he has been working with young refugees already since several years. For example, he worked as a caretaker in different forms of youth welfare services, and he was responsible for the implementation of various education and participation projects. Since last year, 2021, he has been part of the mental health and psychosocial support unit of the International Organization for Migration Germany and the UCare project team. And Jan, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Many thanks for the introduction. Many thanks for the invitation. And many greetings from Berlin. So let me share my screen and start my presentation. So now I have to just find a way to put on the full screen. Yeah, so you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I have chosen the title Lost and Transition for my presentation because it refers to a famous movie you might know, but more importantly, it refers to the very difficult transition process that unaccompanied and separated children have to face once they entered a European member state and applied for asylum or for protection. And I would like to use the next 15 to 20 minutes to take a look at the many challenges unaccompanied minors have to face, and to highlight why this transition process, so the transition from the child protection system to adulthood and to an independent life, is such an enormous challenge for this specific target group of young children. And so we will take a look at the situation of unaccompanied minors, and I will also present the findings of the UCare project. And so before I start with my input, a very brief look at our project. Don't worry, I don't want to use my time to advertise our project, but I guess it's important for the background, so that all of you know what the objectives are. So UCare is an acronym for Unaccompanied Children in Alternative Residence, and the objective or the main goal of the project is to improve and strengthen alternative care systems for unaccompanied and separate children in Belgium, Germany, and Greece. So UCARE is an international project next to the IOM mission in Germany. Also our colleagues in Belgium and Greece are involved. And my colleagues in Greece and Belgium, they are focusing on the recruitment of foster care providers. So when unaccompanied and separate children enter the European Union, they're either placed in, I mean, there are differences among the European member states, but in a simplified manner, we can say that they're either placed in a foster or a guest family, or they're placed in a youth welfare institution, or a shelter, which is is particularly designed for the needs of unaccompanied children. So my colleagues, they're focusing on the topic of foster care and the recruitment of foster care providers. And IOM Germany, my mission is concentrating or focusing on older unaccompanied children or unaccompanied minors. And so this includes all children and young adults from the age of 16 to the age of 21. Other objectives is the training and capacity building of professionals and care providers, and the organization of transnational exchange of best practices. So, and over the past 12 months, we have worked closely with various youth welfare organizations who are in charge or responsible for the care and assistance of unaccompanied children or unaccompanied refugees in Germany. And above all, or more importantly, we are in close exchange with unaccompanied children who are currently living in a youth welfare organization or in a residential group, and with unaccompanied young adults. So young adults who who lived in a youth welfare organization and now transitioned to an independent life. And we have regular focus group discussions. So the young adults and the unaccompanied minors, they're really closely involved in the whole development process of the care concepts. And I guess that's a particularity of the project, that we really try to involve the children and young adults in the whole development process, and that they really have the space and also the time to point out their wishes, their experiences, and also their suggestions for improvement of the care systems. Before we take a closer look at the transition to adulthood and all the challenges and obstacles, a brief look at the overall situation of unaccompanied and separated children. So unaccompanied children are among the most vulnerable groups of migrants and refugees, and the reasons why these children leave their home country without their family are manifold. So they are forced to flee from danger, from crises, from conflict, and many of them are also seeking a better future overall. And these reasons, so the reasons can be political, they can be environmental, social, or economical, but in the most cases, and this is also the experience you get when you're working with these children, this is usually, it's not a single reason. So these in real life or in practice, these reasons overlap, and usually there are several reasons why they left their home country without their parents or a caregiver. And the fact that they are underage and start their journey, their desperate journey, without their caregivers, of course, exposes them to many dangers on their flight or their migration route, and also exposes them particularly to become victim of human trafficking. So unaccompanied minors are not only a particular vulnerable group, they're also a particular burdened group of migrants. Many international studies show that unaccompanied minors go through more traumatic experiences and suffer more frequently from mental disorders compared to other refugee minors or adults. So unfortunately, I missed the first half an hour, but I know that there was already a presentation of regarding unaccompanied minors. So I hope I don't repeat the points, but in general, and this is also my experience working in direct practice with these youngsters for many years. We have PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, and they also often experience severe anxiety, depression, and psychosomatic disorders. And yeah, they must cope with this situation without the support of their parents, and at the same time, they must orientate themselves in a new cultural environment. And so there are many challenges and obstacles at the same time and in parallel that they have to go through and to overcome. And these challenges are often described with the concept of the so-called concept of triple transitions. So first of all, we have the transition every human being is experiencing. So the transition from adolescence to adulthood with all the related cognitive changes and emotional changes. We have the transition related to migration that leads to the detachment from the country of origin and the need to build up a new life in a foreign environment, in a foreign cultural environment and social environment. And we have the transition related to overcoming trauma that experience in the home country or during the flight. So overall, a very difficult starting position. Once unaccompanied children reach the European Union or Germany, I've chosen there are differences, as I said before, among the European member states, but overall, specific safeguards and regulations apply regarding their accommodation, care, and assistance. So in Germany, now I'm taking a look at the situation in Germany, and this is also the figure which is shown here that shows or gives an overview of the whole process of accommodation, care, and assistance. So once unaccompanied refugee or migrant enters Germany and they are taken into care by the local youth welfare officers. So the German Youth Welfare Department or the local youth welfare officers, they're responsible for the care and the assistance of these youngsters. And when they're taken into care, this is this first step that we see here on the left side. Initial clarification is carried out. So it is the social workers try to clarify what the family situation is, if the health status of the young person, and also all the next important steps that are relevant for the asylum process, for the integration process, also for the further education and so on and so on. And care is provided, accommodation is provided, and also a legal guardian is appointed. And after this first step, called preliminary taking into care, the youngsters are, yeah, next steps follow. But what I want to point out is this is actually quite a systematic and also well-functioning system of care and assistance. The major problem, or the biggest problem of the system, is that it usually ends once the minors turn 18. And there is a chance that youth welfare services are prolonged up to the age of 21, but for the vast majority, youth welfare services come to an abrupt end with the 18th birthday. And this is what makes the transition to adulthood such an enormous challenge. So this overall phase, let's say from the 17th birthday up to the point once they turn 18, is really a phase fraught with many challenges and obstacles. So when they turn 18, they lose the particular safeguards they were entitled to when they were minors, and all the essential support structures, such as residence permits, accommodation, access to youth welfare services, and also the guardianship comes to an end at the same time. So there are many transitions at the parallel again, and at the same time they have to overcome. And another key challenge is also the short amount of time available to prepare the youngsters for a self-managed life in Germany or another European member state. So more than the half of the youngsters arriving in Germany, this is now not for the European Union, that's the case in Germany, more than the half of the youngsters are in the ages between 16 and 18. So considering that for the majority of these youngsters, the support provided by the youth and welfare system ends when they reach adulthood, there's very little time left to actually prepare the newcomers for a self-managed life here in Germany. So the education situation has to be clarified, language acquisition, a lot of different tasks related to the integration, and in the end also a housing solution has to be found, and job training has to be started. So this is supposed to happen in the end in this 1.5 years after the arrival in Germany. So I guess it's obvious that and actually also all the local authorities and caretakers, everybody is aware that this time is actually way too short to adequately prepare a young person for these challenges. And a central finding, not only of our project, this is also commonly known, is that there's a lack of specific support structures that accompany this very critical transition phase. So besides some local initiatives or some initiatives by NGOs, there are simply no structures that really support this critical time. And this is a reason why the transition to adulthood is such a challenging and also decisive phase for these youngsters. And because of these missing structures, a lot of these young persons, after a short time of relatively stability when they were in the youth welfare system and they had care and assistance was provided, again they come into they face the risk of marginality, and many of them again experience existential crises. And now I come quick look at the numbers to really highlight the point, how important or how devastating this lack of these support structures at this transitional phase is. So what we see here at this figure is the number of unaccompanied minors who were placed in the German youth welfare system between 2015 and 2020. And what we see is that at the end of 2015, more than 65,000 unaccompanied minors and unaccompanied young adults. This is the orange part indicates the number of young adults. The blue part indicates, the blue part indicates the number of unaccompanied minors. And so we see the end of 2015 and the peak of the so-called refugee crisis. We had more than 65,000 children and young adults in the youth welfare system, in the German youth welfare system. And what we can see in the between 2015 and 2020, this number declined drastically from 56,000 to about 21,000. But what we can also see is that at the end of 2020, there were actually more young adults in the German youth welfare system than minors. So all this huge intake, or the huge number of young persons who entered the German youth welfare system in the year 2014, 2015, 2016, they are now young adults. But this number, what we see here at the end of 2020, these are only the young persons who are actually granted further assistance up to the age of 21. There's a way higher number of young adults who already dropped out of the German youth welfare system, or whose youth welfare services were terminated. So we have a large number of young persons or young adults who are pretty much lost without support, struggling to find their way to an independent life in Germany. And these are the findings of our project, and also the findings of the exchange with unaccompanied minors who are still living in a youth welfare organization or institution, or in a residential group, and young adults who already live in their own apartment. So one aspect that was really pointed out or really highlighted by the youngsters were the limited social support networks. So formal and informal networks play a really decisive role in overcoming the many challenges related to this transition phase. But since many of the young, since they are only in Germany for quite a limited time, also their social networks are very limited, and they're almost completely limited to the youth welfare system. So once youth welfare services are terminated and they have to move out, have to move to their own flat, to their own apartment, also all their social environments dissolves or breaks apart. And this is something that was highlighted many times, that this time was experienced as a very, very difficult and also dark time, where they experienced loneliness, and they were also overwhelmed by all the bureaucratic duties they had, and all the bureaucratic matters that they've then suddenly had to face on their own. So it is very, very important. This is one of the central findings that we have, to promote the young persons to establish a social network, formal or informal, that is not limited to the youth welfare system. And this is also the starting point of one of our concepts. I will come back to this later. or in a minute.
Jan, excuse me, you have 2 more minutes left.
Okay. So I'm
Yeah.
speeding up the whole process. Okay, another finding is that securing adequate accommodation is very, very difficult. So and this is also a difficulty. This is linked to a lot of anxiety and concerns for the young persons, because finding an accommodation is, especially in the bigger cities in Germany, became a real challenge. And for unaccompanied young adults who have also maybe limited resident permissions, it is almost impossible to find an adequate flat or an adequate apartment in Germany. And so this is linked, this uncertainty linked to the housing situation once youth welfare services end, is a huge problem. And many of the young persons reported that there was no space or no time left to concentrate on other important topics. That this anxiety of losing their accommodation or not having a secure prospect for their future housing or accommodation, that this is, it's a huge problem for the whole integration process. And last but not least, will come to an end in 1 minute. It is another huge issue and problem for these youngsters is the lack of continuity and social stability. So once youth services come to an end, all the persons they know, all the faces they that accompanied them in the past 1 or 2 years, they're gone from one day to another. And especially during this critical time, they need social stability and they need a person that they can relate on. And so what we found out that volunteer guardianships are one essential link to bridge this gap. But I'm afraid my time is over, and I because it would still take some time to point this out. But many thanks for your attention, and if you have further questions, I guess we would have 1 or 2 minutes. But you can also, this is what my closing remark. I'm also you're invited to get back to me, especially also when you're interested in the concept that we developed with the youngsters. And I'm happy to share further findings and also our concepts of our project. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Yes, Jan, thank you for presenting to us this important research topic. And I personally find this interesting because I worked in a similar project some years ago. And I found it also interesting that the situation for these youngsters changes again when some of them are put together again with families, because many aims that they reached they were thrown back, especially girls and young women and so on when they came. Yeah. But maybe I would suggest that we leave the option for questions or comments for the end of the panel.
Okay.
So then, because we go further with our next speaker, who will introduce to us also examples from the past with with teenagers and so on. And our next speaker is Chiara Renzo, who holds a PhD in history from the joint doctoral program of the Universities of Florence and Siena. Her research focuses on the Jewish displaced persons in post-war Italy. And she wrote a really fascinating article for a research journal, which we are editing together. And I have to admit that Chiara is putting much more work in it and is really more involved than me. So thank you, Chiara, here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me in this very interesting
I just
program.
want to say that this is not everything that you did, but you are also a postdoc at the University of Florence, where Chiara is working on a project related to the fascist internment system during the Second World War. And she was a Rothschild Foundation Hannah Deaf Euro postdoc fellow at the University of Venice, yes, and a postdoc fellow in Yad Vashem. And now it's up to you. No, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Verena. I tried to share the screen first of all. I think that you can see now, probably full screen. Okay. Okay. So first of all, good evening from Italy, and thank you, Verena and Boaz Cohen, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be involved in your program. So my presentation today deals with the experience of the Jewish displaced children in post-war Italy, and I will focus on the role of the Jewish soldiers serving in the Allied Army and the Zionist emissaries from Palestine who laid the ground for a particular kind of rehabilitation program in children homes or youth villages that in the context of the refugee camps in post-war Italy were part of a net of Aksharot. This Hebrew term means preparation, and it refers to a sort of collective living inspired by kibbutz lifestyle, where adults, youth, or children could receive the necessary training for emigration to Palestine. It was, of course, more than this and more complicated than this, but this is like a sort of general definition. First of all, I would like to start my presentation providing you some context on post-war Italy. My starting point for this analysis is summer 1943, when Italy was a country split into two, as you can see from this map. The Allied Army liberated southern Italy, arriving from North Africa, while at the same time the fascist regime collapsed. The monarchy, the Italian monarchy, and the provisional head of the government fled to South Italy under the Allies and signed an armistice, which declared Italy's surrender. However, at the same time, Mussolini, supported by the Germans who invaded Italy from the north, was able to establish the Italian Social Republic. In this part of Italy, still under Nazi and Mussolini's rule, in 1943 marked the beginning of violence and deportation to Nazi extermination camps. More than 6,800 Jews were deported from Italy in this last phase of the war, and this number includes both Italian and non-Italian Jews. The second point I would like to stress is related to the fascist internment system. When Italy entered the war in 1940, the fascist regime interned all those people who were considered dangerous in the specific circumstances of the war, including 400 Italian Jews suspected mainly on a political basis and 6,000 foreign Jews classified as enemy aliens. They were interned in concentration camps. You must consider that there were dozens of concentration or internment camps in Italy. They were also sent to what in Italian is called confino libero, which is translated with this nonsense free internment, which is a sort of house arrest in small towns far from the main military strategic areas. And although the living conditions in these concentration sites were considered bearable, at least until 1943, after the armistice, some of these sites, I'm referring to those in the occupied, in the non-liberated Italy, became part of that mechanism of deportation to Nazi extermination camp. Why am I emphasizing this aspect? Because in 1943, when the Allies invaded South Italy, the first corps of Jewish DPs was formed by around 2,000 non-Italian Jews liberated by the from the fascist concentration camp of Feramonti in Calabria, which is the region forming the foot of Italy. And as you know, among the Allied army were also the so-called Palestinian units, formed by Jewish soldiers from Palestine who enrolled as volunteers in the British Army during the North African campaign, and who later formed the better known Jewish Brigade. Feramonti was the key site where liberated Jews met for the first time Jewish soldiers who provided them help and assistance while the war was still going on and all the borders were closed and no humanitarian mission was allowed to work in Italy. These soldiers were mainly young men in their 20s or graduate from of Zionist youth movement, members of kibbutzim, who in their oral testimonies and official reports insist on their instinct. They all often use this word instinct that moved them to prioritize children and youth in this early phase of the rescue operation. At the end of January 1944, the Jewish soldiers informed the Jewish Agency about the upcoming selection of the first group of 20 children from Feramonti for the creation of the first Akshara, which was called Rishonim, the first ones, established nearby Bari, which is in the region forming the hill of Italy. Jewish soldiers' testimonies and reports shed light on another important aspect. The initial idea to run these programs in a general Zionist framework, avoiding partisanship, in order to not compromise Zionist unity. The Jewish soldiers running the Rishonim Akshara, Tzvi Ankuri, said, the idea was not to give up to ideology, but to get different Zionist ideology working together. Rishonim was the only Akshara kibbutz which had participants from Betar and Hashomer HaTzair, as well as Bahad. This first and only example, challenging and successful unique experience, was later to be changed with the political criterion taking precedence in the Aliyah selection. Ankuri referred to the fact that later the Aksharot became affiliated to different political parties, which, in a way that reflected their political consensus in Palestine, ruled the Jewish DP's migration quotas to Palestine. In 1944, the criteria used by the Jewish soldiers for selecting the candidates among the few displaced children in Feramonti are not clear. So we can only assume what motivated parents to entrust their children to the Jewish soldiers. Aksharot for children or children homes, first of all, responded to daily problems and offered an educational program and a concrete project of resettlement, especially after the war, when unaccompanied children or orphans arrived in Italy with the help of the Jewish soldiers. Many of them saw in these Aksharot or children homes a warm surrogate family. Rethinking about his decision to join the Rishonim Akshara a long time later, Shaul Hirsch was 14 years old at that time, said, each of us had a broken identity. Zionism was the answer to this problem. Thus, we became enthusiastic Zionists. We saw before us the adult generation who got lost. Their wish was to go back somewhere. They believed that the war would end and they would resume their lives just from the point where they had left them off. We were young, but none of us believed it or wanted it. In May 1944, all Rishonim children legally moved to Palestine, except for two of them whose parents did not want to let them go alone. They were replaced mainly by children just arrived with their family from Yugoslavia by the sea to Puglia, which is the region forming the hill of Italy. However, already in October 1944, Rishonim closed and all its members were sent to another Akshara, the Akshara Habonim, in Santa Maria al Bagno di Camp, which is located in the southern edge of the hill of Italy. This camp was established by the Allies in the late 1943, and the refugees were essentially accommodated in clusters of villas like the colorful one that you can see in this photo. These villas were requisitioned by the Allies, but normally were used as summer holiday residence by the local owners. Among the Abonim group coming from Yugoslavia was also the teenager Flora Calderon, originally from Serbia, who arrived in Italy at the beginning of 1944 with her parents and brother, escaping from the Croatian coast. Flora, portrayed in the black and white picture, described her time in Abonim as a happy time, and described the Jewish soldiers running the Akshara, Josef Fleischmann, as everything, I'm quoting, everything for the youth group. He was our teacher, our guide, and our parent. She said that during her experience in the Abonim Akshara, he learned Hebrew songs, he learned how to cultivate the land and to manage this collective life with her young friends. The end of the military operation, however, brought new Jewish DPs into Italy, including many children, and at the same time, new actors began to assist them. Verena before mentioned the UN agency, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and also the International Refugee Organization. There were also Jewish voluntary organizations, and especially the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is also known as Joint. And also there were political emissaries coming from Palestine, who were representative of Zionist, non-Zionist, religious, secular movements that at that time animated the issue. The involvement of these emissaries increased the number of the Aksharot in the country, but at the same time compromised the initial idea to avoid partisanship. Just to give you some numbers related to 1947, when the Jewish DP presence in Italy reached the peak, the total number of Jewish refugees in Italy was around 25,000, and 1/3 of them was distributed in 77 Aksharot. Among these, there were also six Aksharot for children, and as you can see, they were affiliated to different political parties. And as already anticipated, also after the first experiment of the Jewish soldiers, factionalism won over Zionists United, and Aksharot began to be managed by an umbrella organization coordinating all these political parties, which was called Merkaz Chalutz, the Pioneer Center. The Pioneer Center played a leading role in designing the educational program for children, both in the Aksharot, where it directly dictated the guidelines, and indirectly in the refugee camps through the member working within the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. One of them was the man that you can see in this photo, surrounded by children. His name was Tzvi Aldubi. He was sent to Santa Maria al Bagno in 1946 and worked as coordinator of the cultural affair. I had the chance to access his private archives with other two colleagues, Chinoam Aldubi and Michal Peles Almagor. And with them, we are working on the role of theater as a cultural training for Aliyah. And indeed, today I'm showing you this picture because this soldier and emissaries arriving from Palestine brought their ideologies among the children, but also their way to educate them towards their prospected future in Palestine. Aldubi Private Archives documented the tensions behind the development of such educational activities helping us to understand how culture behind ideology was envisaged as a powerful political tool, both for the rehabilitation of the children and for building their pioneering identity. Al-Dubi believed that, I'm quoting, the sons of Israel, as he used to say, should be educated within a Jewish and preferably a Zionist surrounding. For instance, he was very concerned about the fact that some teenager in the camp attended the Italian school in the nearby town. From Al-Dubi perspective, these children educated, I'm quoting, in the shadow of the cross, in Jesuit school, on the knees of the clergy, end of the quote, risked to compromise their Jewish identity. Moreover, Al-Dubi arranged several recitals and plays for children. Very frequently, he organized public events which serve as a medium to reach the camp population at large, kindling their sense of belonging to a specific ethnic and national group, as Al-Dubi used to say. In the school exhibition organized by Al-Dubi for children, redemption, heroism, and sacrifice emerge as common themes, also typical of the Zionist pioneering repertoire. For instance, during this recital, he associated the heroic feats of the biblical figures and the enterprises of the pioneers in the land of Israel to the Jewish DP's resistance and struggle for Aliyah in the DP camp. Another key site for Jewish displaced children in Italy was Selvino Children Home, which was established and run by another Jewish soldier, Moshe Zeiri. It was established in a former fascist boarding school called Scesopoli in the foothills of the Alps. Selvino Children Home was one of the many, was often considered a sort of model, a children paradise, and was indeed a place where hundreds of Jewish children, many of whom were orphans, found their home and war environment after the war. Zeiri managed Selvino Children Home according to the secular socialist principles of his movement, Gordonia. Children study half a day and dedicated the rest of the time to housework and agricultural work. And the goal of the Akshara was to teach children collective responsibility, self-help, and mutual aid. Selvino, as one of the most documented children home in Italy, can help us understand the challenges of this model of collective rehabilitation and the debate and tensions behind the activities of the Jewish soldiers and the emissaries from Palestine. For instance, some of the worker of the joint expressed their doubts regarding this one-directional discipline and perceived the Zionist children home as a form of control over the Jewish DP's education and resettlement. The discussion mainly revolved around the personality and pedagogical approach of Selvino leader, who was recognized as a paternal figure, but also as a strong and sometimes authoritative leader who sacrificed children's needs for his political ideals. Other workers of the joint instead really appreciate and consider his work as I can say almost perfect. It comes to light that children homes based on a collective way of life smothered the individual needs of the children. For example, Zehiri discouraged the choice of the children to join their relatives in the refugee camps. This was the case of Sidney Zoltak, who initially had convinced his parents to let him join Selvino with a friend, but finally asked Zehiri to visit his mother in the DP camp in Cremona. But Zehiri did not understand the need of the children and expelled him from the children home. Another example are small but habitual conflicts between Zehiri and the children, which were related to food. One of the children remembered that probably he did not understand that they had, I'm quoting, a special hunger, referring to a sort of obsession concerning food deriving from the traumatic experience of the war. Finally, the tension between the political parties operating in Italy can be analyzed from the letters between Zahiri and one of his closest collaborator, the Italian Jew Matilde Cassin. Soon after the establishment of Selvino, she was finally able to reunite with her fiancé, the Florentine pioneer Max Varadi, who came back from Palestine to Italy as an emissary of a religious Zionist movement, Apoleia Mizrahi. And from Florence, Matilde Cassin addressed dozens of letters to Zahiri in the attempt to find a way to involve her husband-to-be in Selvino. For instance, she wrote, I believe that a perfect collaboration between the three of us would be possible. Are you ready for this, Moshe? I think that our home must not be home for political parties, as we must give our children those spiritual and moral values which are above parties, eternal. We must be able to collaborate all together on the same level, since we all have the same method and the same ideal. To conclude, Matilde Cassin, Moshe Zahiri, and Max Varadi really were working towards the same ideal, taking care of children and youth people and educating them about Aliyah and life in a kibbutz. Moshe Zahiri was aware that Matilde Cassin returning to Selvino was necessary both to alleviate his workload and for the well-being of the children who miss her maternal presence. However, ideologies prevailed and this collaboration never took place. Moshe Zahiri, on the one hand, continued to run Selvino Children Home according to the principle of Gordonia, whereas Max Varadi opened another religious children home in Florence, which is Givat Yeled, and was opened in 1946 for religious Zionist children. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chiara. Very interesting. And yeah, it's always interesting to learn from these camps and these approaches and Zahiri and so on. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And now we are already 20 minutes before 6 in Israel, here to 7. And I have the pleasure now to introduce our last speaker for today, which is Esther Bernsen. And she is a psychologist and wrote her thesis about at the Psychosocial Center for Refugees. It's called Zentrum Überleben. It's like a center for survival in Berlin, in which she researched the transgenerational transmission of war trauma. Besides that, she worked for 2 years in a youth welfare facility for traumatized unaccompanied minor refugees in Berlin. And in recent years, she had been working with refugees and still leads an NGO in Berlin, which promotes participation and integration. At the moment, she is working at AMCHA, Germany, and is leading the project Hakara, Confronting Transgenerational Trauma since 2021. This project supports psychosocial care for second-generation Holocaust survivors in Israel. And now it's yours, Esther.
Thank you, Verena. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. Okay. Let me try to. Okay, can you still see my screen without my notes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to talk to you today on this very important topic that touches different areas in which I have worked with. I started to work with refugees and traumatized populations, as you mentioned before, already during my psychology studies. I also volunteered in refugee camps, and I also worked in a foster care, so I could relate to many things that Jan mentioned before. Yes, and I also worked in my thesis on the topic of transgenerational trauma transmission. Now I work with AMCHA, yeah, I will also tell you a bit more about what this organization does in Israel as well as in Germany. And as you mentioned before, I'm not a historian, but I'm a psychologist, so I will also share this psychological perspective on trauma and its effects. And yeah, it often sounds very, it's always focused on disorders and pathology. So I hope you have this in mind, because it's only one part of the whole picture, but it's this part that I will talk about today. Okay, so I will start right away to tell you a bit more about AMCHA Israel. Most people who are treated today by AMCHA Israel are in fact child survivors. They were on average 13 years old in 1945. And from the beginning on, AMCHA worked not only with the survivors themselves, but also with the families. Psychosocial support for Holocaust survivors and their family is provided in 15 centers around Israel. And in the past years, we can see that when survivors age, they face additional challenges and losses, such as losing a spouse or family members, losing physical and mental capacities. So their needs grow, and also the support networks becomes more limited. We can see that these new challenges and losses are layered on challenges and losses from the Holocaust, including unresolved grief and other traumatic experiences. That is why the number of therapy hours is increasing in recent years, but not the number of clients that are treated. Also, the need for therapy in the second generation of survivors have been increasing, as the numbers show. In contrast to AMCHA Israel, AMCHA Germany does not provide direct psychosocial support to survivors or their offspring. AMCHA Germany was founded in 1988 as a support organization for AMCHA Israel. So we support AMCHA financially, but we also run educational projects, for example, in schools, exhibitions, and we work on publications and trainings and exchange for mental health professionals. So now I would like to begin with this quote by the psychologist Krell, in which he describes the experience of child survivors after the war. So silence is the language of the child survivor. We might have talked after the war, but adults persuaded us to get on with life, forget the past. Adults who themselves had survived and suffered so much inadvertently diminished the experience of children. In the aftermath, in that silence which enveloped our existence, what needed saying was not said. So many of the Holocaust survivors that live today were children during World War II. Children who, we heard it before in several talks, children who suffered sudden loss, abandonment, hunger, persecution. And after the war, they made every effort to rebuild their shattered lives. But we have to say that not all succeeded due to these traumatic events. And many, but not all, continue to struggle with their traumatic past. So the psychological consequences of being a child during Holocaust and crisis can be very long-lasting. And now I would like to briefly describe to you the clinical pictures that some psychologists described. Among them is also Nathan Kellerman, who was once the clinical director of AMCHA Israel, and he published many books and articles around the topic of Holocaust studies, child survivors, and also transgenerational transmission of trauma. So there are different impairments that are described also according to the age of the traumatization. And child survivors, they they had different ways of coping with the past and the traumatic events. That sometimes they avoided the topic or even had amnesia, and sometimes there was also obsessive preoccupation of the past. So child survivors may be well adapted, but trauma can also manifest itself in a stressful situation even years after. So another big problem for child survivors may be the topic of separations from friends, family members, or even their own children. For example, when they themselves become adults and move out of the house. This can be another very traumatic experience for them. So separations later in life may be experienced as very stressful, and interpersonal relations therefore are sometimes kept shallow to prevent future painful separation from loved ones. So such an early traumatization can really reverberate across the entire lifespan of the child survivor. And many of the early strategies they learned to survive, not only physically, but also mentally, are maintained all through life. Such strategies can be dissociation or numbing, so less feelings, denial, or even amnesia. So these strategies can result in suspicion and also distrust in personal relations. Many clinicians reported that child survivors needed a different psychosocial approach than adult survivors because the memories of children are less verbal, so it's also difficult for them to verbalize those traumatic childhood experiences. And most survivors, they also still suffer from psychological distress symptoms today. And also these symptoms are even more severe than immediately after the war. And also many child survivors even looked for treatment very late in life, because as I mentioned earlier, when traumatized people grow older, sometimes the experience manifests itself and they have a need for support and for therapy, even in very late in life. And all in all, Nathan Kellerman, he coined the term child survivor syndrome to describe this clinical picture of survivors who were in need for support and therapy. And this concept is very similar to the concept or the diagnosis of complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is a diagnosis in the ICD-11 by the World Health Organization. And it can be found often after severe and multiple or sequential traumatization. So it's often not only one event, but several and over a longer period of time. Among these symptoms are re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance and numbing, hyperarousal, and also flashbacks and nightmares, among others. So we can say that many, not all, but many child survivors suffered mentally all through her life from the experiences, and this impaired their own well-being, but also their social life and their relationships in families, and especially with their own children when they had family and children later. The trauma, as I mentioned earlier, affected the children of the child survivors. This was started to being reported in the 60s or late 60s and 70s by clinicians who reported that many second generation clients were in therapy, which suggested for them that the second generation was also affected by their parents' experience. And they started to research and talk about the term transgenerational transmission of trauma. What does it mean? It basically means that people are affected by collective violence who were not directly exposed to the traumatic events. So children report, for example, to have nightmares about camps and persecution, even in families where nobody even directly spoke about their traumatic experience. So the question was, are the generations tied to each other, or can the offspring disentangle from the traumatic experience of their parents? The phenomenon of the transgenerational transmission has been described and studied worldwide in different populations. So in war veterans, survivors of the genocide in Rwanda, survivors of Fukushima and Nagasaki, and also in refugee populations. But most evidence comes from Holocaust survivors and their families. And the transmission in Holocaust families has been also described extensively in literature, in film, in documentaries, in graphic novels. So not only in scientific publications, but from the late 60s on, it was also described by mental health professionals, especially in Israel. And until now, even though there is a lot of research, it is still a topic in dispute, because in the beginning, studies did not show consistent findings. They were researching what is transferred, and in the beginning, they thought there was a direct transmission of symptoms from one generation to the other. And they also discussed and researched how it is transferred, what is the mechanism. But all in all, we can say that with randomized controlled studies in non-clinical populations, those studies failed to confirm the assumption of an increased rate of psychopathology in the offspring of Holocaust survivors. But, trauma transmission is therefore not an inevitable consequence of the parent's traumatization. But it can be an outcome of various different factors. Some of them I show here, and I will only mention that one thing that could be shown consistently is a vulnerability for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress syndrome, in the second generation. So the transmission of trauma manifests itself in specific circumstances. For example, when the second generation themselves are facing traumatic events such as war, cancer, or a pandemic. And it makes the children of survivors more vulnerable to suffer from post-traumatic stress when they experience this kind of stress. The mechanism, so why or how this happens, is still being discussed and researched, and I will not really go into detail here because the time is very limited. So knowing this, we understand trauma as a process and not a single incident that is over at some point. And we can also gain a common understanding of trauma among survivors of collective violence, children and adults, and a common ground for psychosocial work with traumatized persons, and the conditions that are necessary for effective treatment and rehabilitation. So, and I think this is also very relevant today in Germany, where a great number of refugees live, who come from countries where they experienced war, loss of family members, and often a traumatic journey to even come here. And we heard about this in the talk, for example, by Jan Graf earlier. So I will share briefly with you some numbers of adults and children who came to Germany and the prevalence of trauma and post-traumatic stress in these populations. So on average, there's a study that shows that on average, 30% of the refugees have a diagnosis of a PTSD. So meaning in Germany alone, we had in 2019, roughly 500,000 refugees with that diagnosis. This is an estimation. And then here's the numbers of minors who applied for asylum in Germany in 2020, which was around 55,000. And I estimate that the prevalence of trauma and post-traumatic stress is even higher in this population. Okay, so what can we learn from the past? I would suggest a multimodal support over the life cycle for the individuals, because recovering from trauma is a lifelong process, and we have to provide supports such as psychotherapeutic, social, legal support, and medical whenever the need emerges. This can be in different life periods and does not always have to be right after a crisis. And we can also define common principles for understanding trauma and shaping psychosocial interventions. I will just briefly mention two key necessary elements that were also developed on a exchange between Israeli and German mental health professionals. Those are recognition and community. Community is needed to heal the traumatic past, especially when it's caused by man-made trauma. So establishing, promoting, and maintaining communities is a necessary condition for the provision of mental health care and interventions. And community and support is also needed for the helpers because they are sometimes faced with isolation, with burnout, with pessimism, and with a big workload. And this is also something I know from my experience when I worked in a youth welfare organization. So, and the next and the last point is recognition. Because trauma resulting from collective violence and displacement caused by political and social factors also affect the political and societal space. So it is the society who has the responsibility to treat traumatized persons and populations and to enable them to reintegrate into society. Recognizing the suffering and harm that was experienced by the victims and the survivors especially of man-made violence is of very high importance for their recovery, and the injustice and the harm done to them must be recognized. And the person who suffered from trauma and injustice must be supported immediately and in long term, so they can live in safety and heal from their traumatic past. The awareness and the willingness of the society to recognize and treat traumatized people and populations is therefore a precondition to alleviate the burden of trauma in a person's life. And with this, I would like to end my presentation. I will share with you my email address if you would like to reach out. I will be happy if you get in touch, and thank you.
Yes, Esther, thank you. And we are we are at the end of another very interesting panel. And I think we have some more, little time left for some questions, because I saw there were some questions, or one question to Chiara and one question to Esther. Maybe the audience or the people who ask this can ask it now.
Oh, read it.
Yeah, but I have to search it. Here. So the first question to Chiara.
It has two versions.
Yes.
Yes.
Because maybe you repeat the question, Chiara, or shall I read it? Question to Chiara. It's on the frames of criteria to joining to Hafshara was cases of discrimination on background of social and socio-economic belonging.
I'm not sure I got the question, but in the particular context of the refugee camps, many were affiliated to Aksharot, especially in Italy, which was a sort of a was defined as the gate to Zion. So the last stop before going to Palestine. Many hope to do so in a very quick time, but many of them had to wait a long time. I never find, I didn't find any evidence of discrimination as a motivation to join Akshara or Aksharot. But for instance, for religious DPs was a little bit complicated at the beginning because they didn't have political representation among. They had to fight to get to be recognized as a political group and to find their representative from Achi or Agudat Israel. But at the end, they had their Aksharot. But yeah, at the beginning was a little bit discriminating because the context of the Jewish units of the the Palestinian units was secular, predominantly secular, so they had to fight to get their own Aksharot.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
There's one more question to Esther.
Yes, there's another question by Mr. Shmuel Yerushalmi, which and he asked Eska if it is a syndrome of survivor children. I understand the question like of survivor children. Is it a syndrome of survivor children having any impacts also on grandsons and great-grandsons of Holocaust survivors?
Yeah, thank you, Shmuel, for the question. Actually, there is a lot of research that is dealing with the question whether or how or what has been transmitted to the grandchildren and grand-grandchildren. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on the third and fourth generation, but there is literature and some evidence that it also affected the third and the fourth generation.
Okay, so we come to the finishing remarks. Verena.
So maybe, Boaz, you wanted to start, or shall I start? Maybe you?
You start.
Okay, so it was again, thank you to the speakers, first of all, and thank you, the audience, which is still left now. And yes, it was always a pleasure. It was again a pleasure to have you here. And I think I just made some notes about research questions from the past, which are relevant for today and the other way around. For example, what I find interesting about this transition process about which Jan spoke, for example, into an independent life, I think this would be also interesting to focus more on the past and so on. Yeah, and this is what we would like also to stress today, because we are at the moment in the process of establishing a larger project on bringing past and present together, and we are always grateful for any hints or tips or collaboration with other researchers or practitioners. Yes. Boaz?
Okay, I think it turned out that to do a project on war and do a Holocaust affected children on the day of a new war in Europe is very strong in a way. And I think that we really saw today, like Verena said, that the questions work both ways. Like researchers coming from academy have a lot to learn from the people in the field, to know what questions they should ask on the work, on the people they are researching, on the children that are researching. On the other hand, I believe we believe this is actually the bulwark of the main claim of our project, is that also people today can be enriched, and people working today can gain from learning how people did relate to these issues 70 years ago. Of course, there were a lot of child refugees in the middle also. We are not inventing the wheel. It's not that the historians have some big truth that the people in the field don't know. But when we started the project, I went to speak in the ICC in The Hague. I gave a guest lecture on this concept. And I don't know, one of the big judges there, he said that actually the importance of the historian's work is that it can enlarge, open the horizons for the people working today. In the same way that we are learning now that the people, the learning about the work today opens the horizons of the historians looking at the children of the past. As Verena said, we are interested in collaborating with this and with other people. We are interested to build research projects on this, interdisciplinary, past and present. We are really, we want to hear more. So we will really finish with a prayer for a prayer. I'm not doing religious coercion here, but in any prayer for the children now undergoing now the terrors of war, and pray for a swift ending to this situation. So thank you, everyone. Be in touch with us, and we will be happy to meet you again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Due to the amazing speakers we had.
Bye.